All right, so we are now almost exactly a year out from Joe Biden deciding to continue with the Trump policy of withdrawing from Afghanistan, and I gave him credit for doing that for obvious reasons. I mean, I didn't even think that we should have gone into the country in the first place, definitely not for some large-scale occupation and a drawn-out 2 decades-long war, so I gave Joe Biden credit on that front, but, and there's a pretty big but attached to this, the policy of Joe Biden and his administration after the pullout from Afghanistan has somehow been even more disastrous for the country than the war itself. And that might seem like a pretty big statement, but as we get into some of the details here from this Axios article, I think you're going to see exactly what I mean by that. So they say 1 year after the US withdrew and the Taliban retook control of Afghanistan, the country remains a nation in anguish. And they say the Afghan people have borne the brunt of a collapsed economy, deepening humanitarian crisis and deteriorating human rights situation. And the Taliban began retaking parts of the country as the US-led coalition began its exit a year ago. And by August 15th, 2021, far earlier than the US expected or had planned for, Kabul was back in the hands of the group that had ruled with a brutal grip in the 1990s. So keep in mind a couple of different things already before we get to more of the details in terms of how bad of a situation it currently is in the country. Just understand, like, we're talking about the Taliban, okay? As they point out here, the same group that had control over the country in the 1990s. We just waged a 2 decades-long war where we spent trillions of dollars on this war, funneling money to the military-industrial complex. We wasted who knows how many thousands of civilian lives and people who were injured, people who were traumatized by our invasion and occupation, by our drone program in the country, and all of that was just to end up exactly back at square one with the same group, the Taliban, controlling this country. So, I mean, just a completely failed foreign policy operation here that had absolutely disastrous consequences. But if you're the Biden administration and you finally decide to end this endless war, then you could have done something positive, and you could have tried to, push for a revitalization of Afghanistan. You could have tried to, help with their economic recovery, given the fact that we basically handed over the country back to the Taliban willingly. You could have done some really positive things in trying to make up for the brutality of that 2 decades-long war, but instead he's choosing to exacerbate the situation as much as physically possible. So they say in the years since the withdrawal, life for most of the 40 million Afghans in the country has gotten in many ways only worse. And they say the economy in peril. Over the last year, the country's economy has imploded. The Afghan government's 2022 budget is down over 60% from its 2020 level. And prior to 2021, the country was reliant on foreign aid for 75% of public spending. And keep in mind, there was just absolutely rampant corruption going on within the US-backed government of Afghanistan. So a little bit of information on that from NBC News. They say the Taliban's swift conquest is attributable to many factors, but one that crosses multiple administrations yet is getting very little attention right now is the corruption, and specifically the kind of corruption the US aided and abetted over many years, glad-handing crooked officials and stalling anti-corruption investigations as ordinary Afghans struggled and watched officials grow wealthier and wealthier. And while corruption can hardly be described as the sole reason for the Afghan government's disintegration, it is a consistent through line of multiple American administrations and an element that the US has consistently overlooked. So that was part of, or one of the largest reasons as to why the Afghan government collapsed so quickly, is that, these people didn't necessarily have anything to fight for. There was no real functioning government, and part of that is because, again, 75% of their public spending was coming from foreign aid. A lot of that aid was being corruptly pocketed by a lot of Afghan officials who were backed by the United States government, who was giving them cover during the war. So, I mean, that's just one tiny aspect of this, but, it's something that shouldn't be overlooked, especially as a lot of this foreign aid has been drying up since the Taliban retook the country. But they say the U.S. decision to freeze billions of dollars in foreign reserves belonging to Afghanistan's central bank has left the bank incapable of carrying out many of its essential functions, and additionally, sanctions on the Taliban have led many banks and other financial institutions outside of the country to restrict or block the processing of most transactions involving Afghan bank accounts, according to Human Rights Watch. And they say basic household goods inflation is at a 52% year-on-year, and per capita income is down to to about $375 per year, its lowest level in over a decade. So I want you guys to understand the dynamic of what is going on here, okay? It's not necessarily that, there's not enough food in the country to feed these people, or that there's not enough, other materials or direct supplies for the people in the country. It's that because of the United States policy, both in sanctioning the Taliban and in straight up looting their central bank and stealing $7 billion from the Afghan people, basically what has resulted is that, people can't even go and withdraw money from the banks, right? There's lines, there's queues lining up for people to go and be able to withdraw cash that they have in the banks, because the central bank doesn't have that $7 billion or almost $10 billion if you're including money that has been stolen by other entities as well outside of the United States. They just don't have the money to meet up with the demand that people are needing in terms of money being withdrawn. And so it's led to a 52% year-on-year inflation rate in the country on just basic goods like food, etc. But now we get into some of the catastrophic humanitarian crisis part of this. They say an economy in peril, a severe drought, and other factors have left about 24 million Afghans, more than half of the country's population, in need of humanitarian assistance, according to the UN. Okay, 24 million people. Okay, over half of the country's population in need of immediate humanitarian assistance. Nearly 20 million people face acute food insecurity, and tens of thousands are facing catastrophic levels of hunger, and at least 1.1 million Afghan children are expected to suffer from the most severe form of malnutrition this year. So the Biden administration, in other words, is choosing to starve this country, choosing to starve not the Taliban, the innocent men, women, and children within Afghanistan who are already suffering under Taliban rule. He is choosing to starve them basically because he doesn't want to face the political backlash from Republicans and other Democrats for being perceived as like helping the Taliban by giving this money back to the central bank. I mean, one way or another, we know the Taliban is in control of this country, okay? You can't make some sort of a human rights argument, which we're going to get to the atrocities being committed by the Taliban here in a second, but the point is, you can't label, the Taliban, oh, they're just these, terrible terrorists and they're committing all these human rights abuses, so we can't give them back the money. You just sold hundreds of millions of dollars in weapons to Saudi Arabia, okay? We continue giving billions of dollars in military aid to Israel on a regular basis, okay? Two of the worst human rights violators on the planet right now. The United States empire doesn't have a problem with committing human rights abuses, let alone funding other countries and dictatorial regimes and, far-right theocratic governments like Saudi Arabia. We have no problem with giving money to people who commit widespread human rights abuses and fund terrorism around the region and around the world, okay? That is not the argument being made here, but that's the argument they want to convince people. Oh, we can't give this money back to the Taliban because they're so awful and horrific to the innocent people. What you are doing right now by withholding this $7 billion is committing worse atrocities, worse human rights abuses to millions of people in Afghanistan than whatever the Taliban will be able to do. So, it's just completely ridiculous framing there from the majority of the mainstream media, from the majority of Democrats, from Joe Biden himself, and from the entirety of the Republican Party. But now we get to the allegations of human rights abuses being committed by the Taliban, because while I don't think that that's a good argument to still withhold these funds, I do think that it's still important to point out these things wherever they happen in whatever country they happen to be taking place in. So they say here, deteriorating human rights situation. The Taliban promised the world that they had changed, especially on human rights. A year later, the group's promises remain largely unfilled. Schools are still closed to most girls and young women after the 6th grade, and the reasons given for the ban range from religious to cultural to technical, but whatever it is, it's harming Afghanistan more than it's harming anyone else. And women also face severe restrictions reminiscent of the crackdowns on freedoms that they faced during the last time that the Taliban ruled. And they say that the Taliban officials have cracked down on the media, and human rights groups have documented arbitrary arrests and summary executions of dissidents. And meanwhile, the violence that once plagued the country has drastically been reduced, though deadly attacks and security challenges still persist. So, understand the reality of what is taking place here, okay? Again, you have the very valid things to point out in terms of human rights abuses, summary executions, the treatment of women, the treatment of innocent people and stuff like that. That's all fair to talk about, fair to point out, etc. Right? I'm not afraid to go and criticize the government of Saudi Arabia or Israel for their human rights abuses. So you shouldn't do the same for Afghanistan. They don't get a free pass. But in other words, it's fair to point out those things, but at the same time, that's not a valid argument for the situation that is taking place right now at the behest of the Biden administration. Okay, we went to this country, we invaded this country, all right, under the guise of like counterterrorism operations. We ended up staying there for 2 decades, okay, spending trillions of dollars on this endless war, terrorizing the civilian population there. And now, as we have left the country and we are returning it back to the same hands that were in it when we entered the country in the first place, we are turning around and looting them and stealing money from their central bank and refusing to give it back under the guise of basically the same exact reason why we went into the country in the first place. And again, as disastrous as the human rights abuses being committed by the Taliban are right now, it's not as bad, or what we're doing is significantly worse. And that's just not, my opinion, or I'm not just pulling that out of my ass. I mean, you can go and look at videos and testimonies of women in Afghanistan who are facing a lot of those human rights abuses, and even they say that, it's one thing to criticize whether or not schools are accepting women in them, but what the fuck does that matter if the women in question can't even afford to put food on the table or to feed their families? I mean, it's like, you have to get your priorities in order here, and the priority in Afghanistan should be on the fact that there are tens of millions of people who are on track to either starve, suffer from malnutrition, or otherwise suffer from this, complete looting of their country and a refusal by the Biden administration to prioritize actual human rights abuses currently being committed by his own administration in the country, and putting that over the idea that maybe we should try to resume some semblance of like normal relations with the country, or try to, maybe pay some reparations for the destruction that we caused to the people of Afghanistan. So, I mean, I don't know what to call this dynamic other than genocidal, because again, they're talking about millions of people who are, innocent men, women, and children who are on track to starve right now as a result of the sanctions and as a result of us looting their central banks. So, I mean, you have to fucking return the money, regardless of any of the political calculations and how Republicans are going to say, oh, you're funding the Taliban or whatever the fuck. None of that matters right now, because this is one of the single worst humanitarian crisis facing the planet right now, and this is something that has to be addressed in an immediate sense, or millions of people are going to suffer basically just because of the political calculations of an imperialist like Joe Biden.